What happens when a teacher's attempt to humiliate a student backfires in the most brilliant way? The buzz of middle school chatter filled the air as students filed into room 207 at Westwood Middle School in Cleveland, Ohio. Math class was often a drag for most seventh graders, and today seemed no different. Seated quietly near the back, her eyes downcast and pencil tapping rhythmically against her desk, was a girl named Ellie. At just 12 years old, Ellie had already mastered the art of blending into the background, a skill born from years of being overlooked. Ellie was the kind of student most teachers barely noticed. She rarely spoke unless called on, turned in her homework on time, and avoided attention like it was her life's mission. Yet, there was something about her that made her different, even if no one had noticed yet. Her notebooks, for example, weren't just filled with class notes, but also with advanced math problems far beyond her grade level, solved meticulously in the margins. It was her little secret. Her teacher, Miss Parker, was the complete opposite, known for her sharp tongue and unyielding standards. She had no patience for mediocrity. At 42, she was a seasoned educator who believed in tough love and didn't shy away from calling students out when she thought they were slacking. Some students feared her. Others admired her no-nonsense demeanor. Today, frustration was etched across her face as she scanned the rows of slumped shoulders and blank stares. "This," she said, holding up a worksheet, "is basic algebra. Basic. And yet half of you can't even figure it out." Her voice carried an edge that silenced side conversations instantly. "I've been teaching this unit for weeks, and still nothing." She slapped the paper onto her desk with a sigh that seemed to echo through the room. "What is it going to take to get you all to care?" Ellie kept her eyes fixed on her notebook, pretending to review her work. She wasn't scared of Miss Parker. Not really. But she hated being the center of attention. She'd perfected the art of invisibility, and it had served her well so far. But today, her carefully constructed bubble of anonymity was about to burst. Miss Parker paced at the front of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. "You're going to see questions like these on every test from now until college. If you don't understand them now, you're setting yourself up for failure." Her gaze swept the classroom, lingering on each student for just a second longer than was comfortable. Then her eyes landed on Ellie. "Ms. Bennett," Miss Parker said, her voice slicing through the silence. Ellie's head snapped up in surprise, her stomach tightening. "You've been awfully quiet back there. Let's see if you've been paying attention." Ellie's cheeks burned as the entire class turned to look at her. She wanted to melt into her seat, to disappear, but there was no escape. She forced herself to nod, her voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." But Miss Parker wasn't done. She walked over to the board, grabbed a piece of chalk, and began scribbling furiously. The equation she wrote stretched across the board, a labyrinth of variables and exponents that looked like something out of a college textbook. Gasps and low murmurs rippled through the room as the students realized how absurdly difficult it was. The equation might as well have been written in another language for most of them. Miss Parker turned to Ellie with a raised eyebrow and gestured to the board. "Solve it." Ellie didn't move at first. The weight of the room's attention bore down on her, and the challenge hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The room felt electric, every student watching Ellie with a mix of curiosity and relief that they weren't in her position. Whispers rippled through the class, just loud enough for her to catch snippets. "No way she can do that. What even is that?" And, of course, a muffled laugh or two. Ellie gripped her pencil tighter, her knuckles turning white. Her mind raced, not with panic, but with the instinctive calculations she'd been doing in secret for as long as she could remember. "Any time now," Miss Parker said, crossing her arms and leaning against her desk. Her tone was laced with impatience, her smirk suggesting she didn't expect Ellie to even try. "Or do you need a calculator?" The sarcasm drew a round of chuckles from the class, but Ellie barely noticed. Her focus was narrowing, her thoughts aligning like pieces of a puzzle. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping the floor. It wasn't confidence that pushed her forward, but something quieter, something stronger, a determination that had been simmering just beneath the surface. She stepped to the front of the class, her sneakers scuffing against the tiles, and reached for the chalk. It felt cold in her hand, but she didn't hesitate. The room went silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Ellie's eyes scanned the equation, her brain working at a speed that would have astonished anyone watching. Variables danced in her mind, each one clicking into place like gears in a finely tuned machine. She raised the chalk and started writing. At first, the class didn't know how to react. The initial letters and numbers she scrawled on the board seemed random, disconnected. But then, as more symbols filled the space, a pattern began to emerge. Ellie's movements were deliberate, her strokes steady. She wasn't just solving the problem, she was untangling it, breaking it down into manageable pieces that fit together perfectly. Miss Parker's smirk began to fade. She stepped closer to the board, her arms unfolding as if seeing the equation anew through Ellie's eyes. The room was so quiet now that the sound of the chalk against the board was almost deafening. By the time Ellie reached the halfway point, the whispers had stopped. The class watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the board and Ellie's face. She was calm, her expression focused but not strained. It was as if she had done this 100 times before, because, in some ways, she had. Her nights spent scribbling equations into the margins of her notebooks, her weekends flipping through college-level math books she'd found at the library. All of it had led to this moment. Miss Parker cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "That's interesting," she muttered, but the wavering in her voice betrayed her surprise. Ellie didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She was in her own world now, a place where the challenge wasn't daunting but exhilarating. The final stretch of the equation required multiple steps, each one more complex than the last. Ellie paused for a moment, not because she was unsure, but because she was double-checking her work. Then, with a few swift movements, she wrote the final answer, circled it, and stepped back. The board was filled with her handwriting, a maze of numbers and symbols that somehow made perfect sense. She turned to face the class, her hands dusty with chalk, her breathing steady. Miss Parker stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting over the board. She traced the equation with her finger, muttering under her breath as she checked Ellie's work. Finally, she stepped back, her expression unreadable. But the silence that followed wasn't just from the teacher, it was from the class, too. As they processed what they had just witnessed, Ellie stood at the front of the room, her chalk-stained hands hanging loosely by her sides. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her face betrayed none of it. She scanned the room, briefly catching glimpses of wide eyes and slack jaws. No one was laughing anymore. Miss Parker remained by the board, her gaze fixed on the solution Ellie had written. Her finger traced each line, occasionally pausing as if searching for an error. But there was none. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken, until she finally turned to face Ellie. "How?" Miss Parker began, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. She stopped herself, shaking her head slightly as if trying to process what had just happened. "How did you know to do that?" Ellie shifted on her feet. She didn't like the spotlight, but she also wasn't about to dismiss what she just accomplished. "I've been studying," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It made sense once I broke it down." Miss Parker stared at her, a flicker of disbelief still lingering in her eyes. "Studying on your own?" Ellie nodded. "I like math." A ripple of murmurs spread through the classroom. Some students exchanged glances, others whispered behind cupped hands. No one had expected this, not from Ellie, the girl who always seemed to disappear into the background. But it wasn't just the students who were struggling to make sense of the moment. Miss Parker, a teacher who prided herself on recognizing potential, realized she had missed something extraordinary. She had underestimated a child whose brilliance had been hiding in plain sight. Clearing her throat, Miss Parker gestured toward the board. "Class, let's take a moment to appreciate what just happened here." Ellie not only solved this problem, she did it in a way that demonstrates a level of understanding far beyond what's expected at her age. Her words were measured, but there was a hint of awe in her tone. This is what true talent looks like. Ellie's cheeks flushed at the unexpected praise. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone being celebrated. She glanced back at her seat, longing to retreat to the safety of her desk. But something stopped her. For the first time, she felt a flicker of pride, not because she had proven Miss Parker wrong, but because she had proven herself right. The class, still stunned, began to clap. It started slowly, a smattering of applause from a few students in the back, but it grew louder, more confident. Ellie looked out at her peers, her usually shy demeanor giving way to a small, tentative smile. She hadn't just solved an equation. She had shifted the dynamic of the entire room. Miss Parker raised her hand to quiet the applause, her expression thoughtful. "Ellie," she said, her voice firm but kind, "why didn't you ever speak up before? If you can do this, why haven't you shown it?" Ellie hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain it. How could she put into words the fear of standing out, the comfort of being invisible? "I didn't think anyone would care," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Miss Parker's expression softened, and for a moment, she seemed less like the strict teacher everyone feared and more like someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Well," she said after a pause, "you were wrong about that." As the applause faded and the class returned to their seats, Ellie realized that her world had shifted, whether she was ready for it or not. The rest of the class passed in a daze. Miss Parker attempted to continue the lesson, but the air in the room was different now, charged with a sense of awe and curiosity. Ellie sat quietly at her desk, trying to disappear again, but the whispers from her classmates made it impossible. "That was insane," one boy muttered to his friend. "She's like a genius or something," another girl whispered, sneaking a glance at Ellie. "She made it look so easy." Ellie heard every word, her cheeks burning despite herself. She wasn't used to attention, let alone admiration. Part of her wanted to shrink back into her quiet corner, but another part, a small, growing part, felt something new: pride, validation. For once, she wasn't being ignored. Miss Parker, meanwhile, couldn't stop glancing at Ellie. She had prided herself on spotting hidden potential in her students, but she had missed this entirely. Ellie's quiet brilliance had been right in front of her, and she hadn't seen it. That realization gnawed at her. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Parker called out over the noise of students packing up their things, "Ellie, can you stay for a moment?" The murmurs started again as the other students filed out, sneaking glances at Ellie on their way. She stayed in her seat, clutching her notebook tightly as the last stragglers left the room. Miss Parker walked over, her usual commanding presence softened by something gentler. She sat on the edge of her desk and folded her arms, looking at Ellie thoughtfully. "I owe you an apology," she began, her tone unusually sincere. Ellie blinked, unsure of what to say. "An apology?" Miss Parker nodded. "I underestimated you. I assumed you were just coasting along, but I was wrong. You're extraordinary, Ellie, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ellie wasn't sure how to respond. No teacher had ever spoken to her like this before, not as a student, but as a person. Miss Parker continued, her voice more confident now. "You have a gift, Ellie, and it's not just about solving equations. It's about the way you think, the way you approach problems. That's something rare, and it's something you shouldn't hide." Ellie looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. I didn't think it mattered." "It matters," Miss Parker said firmly. "It matters a lot, and I want to help you, if you'll let me. There are programs, competitions, opportunities that could really challenge you and help you grow. I think you'd be amazing." Ellie's heart raced. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone, of embracing this part of herself, was terrifying, but it was also thrilling. She looked up at Miss Parker, seeing her not as the intimidating teacher she once feared, but as someone who genuinely believed in her. "I'll think about it," Ellie said quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Miss Parker smiled back. "That's all I ask." As Ellie left the classroom, clutching her notebook tightly, she couldn't help but feel that something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she wondered not what she could hide, but what she could become.